"My body's too big. I'm not breeding material," said the woman, but he proved her wrong.
Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
Summer, 1881, Dakota Territory. Pine Creek sat in the middle of a wide, flat stretch of prairie where the wind could move for miles without hitting a thing to slow it. That afternoon, the air was dry enough to crack lips, the heat pressing down from a white sky. The dirt street through the center of town was rutted from wagon wheels, the edges littered with hoof prints baked hard under the sun. Clara Boone kept her head down as she walked past the saloon. The brim of her bonnet shadowed her eyes, but it didn't hide her height. At 7 feet 3 inches, she stood over nearly every man she'd ever met. The pale blue dress she wore had been patched so many times that no two pieces of fabric were exactly the same shade. The neckline had stretched and torn over the years, showing more of her chest than she liked, but she didn't have another dress to change into. Her boots were half a size too small, the leather stiff and worn smooth at the toes. Every step was a dull reminder of how long she'd been walking from place to place with no real home. She didn't like being in town, but she needed flour and a bit of coffee. Her coins, just enough for those two things, were clutched tight in her palm. She could already feel the weight of people's stares without looking up. They'd seen her before, sometimes in the background of their errands, sometimes passing through on her way to somewhere else. This time, though, she was staying close enough to town that she couldn't avoid them. Her family had sent her away 2 months earlier. Her father had said it straight to her face, "No man will take you. You eat too much. You take up too much space." She had packed her things without a word and left before dawn. Since then, she'd slept in sheds and empty barns, working where she could for food. The old Miller barn on the edge of Pine Creek had been her shelter for the last week. No walls on one side, just stacked hay to keep out the worst of the wind. She reached the mercantile porch and dug for her coins, her fingers stiff from gripping them so long. The silver slipped from her hand before she even noticed, hitting the boards and bouncing into the dust. She crouched quickly, trying to gather them before they rolled away, but the prairie wind caught them and sent them spinning. A short, sharp laugh came from somewhere across the street. She knew better than to look. Daniel Reed had just stepped out of the feed store, a 50-pound sack of oats balanced on one shoulder. He was 33, tall at 6'4", with the build of a man who spent most of his days lifting, hauling, and driving wagons across long stretches of open country. His hair was dark brown, worn a little long, and his jaw was shaded with stubble. His eyes, gray-blue and steady, scanned the street in a habit born from years of watching for trouble on the trail. Daniel worked freight, moving goods between towns and rail stops. It wasn't the kind of life that kept a man in one place for long, but lately the moving had started to feel more like running. His older brother, the man who'd raised him after their parents died, had been killed in a freight robbery 2 years ago. Since then, Daniel had been looking for something solid to hold on to. Quietly, without telling anyone, he'd been thinking about a home, a family, a life that didn't disappear every time the wagon moved on. He saw the coins skittering across the ground and walked toward them without hurry. Setting the oat sack against the mercantile wall, he crouched and pressed each coin into the dust with his fingers before the wind could take them further. He stood and offered them to her. "Wind's bad for keeping change in your hand," he said, his voice low and even. Clara looked at him then. She expected the same look she'd seen in so many men's eyes, curiosity mixed with mockery, or worse. But his gaze didn't move past her face. It stayed there, steady and unhurried. "Guess I wasn't watching close enough," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. Daniel tipped his hat once, glanced toward the street, then back at her. "You headed anywhere after here?" She could have said no, could have told him she was fine, but something in his tone made her answer honestly. "The Miller barn." He didn't flinch or frown. "That place won't keep the rain out." He paused, like he was weighing whether to say more. "I've got a room out past the cottonwoods, clean bed. Bolt on the inside, supper most nights." Clara's first thought was that he was joking. Men didn't offer things without wanting something in return. But there was no smirk, no glance down her body, no shifting closer, just the offer, plain and direct. She thought about another night on the hard boards of the barn, the wind cutting through the open wall, the ache in her feet and the knot in her stomach. She thought about how many times she'd been told she didn't belong anywhere. "All right," she said finally. Daniel picked up the sack of oats and stepped to the side, letting her fall in beside him. They started down the street toward the road out of town. People's eyes followed, but neither of them looked back. They left the edge of town behind, the ruts of the main street giving way to a narrow wagon trail lined with dry grass and scattered cottonwoods. The sun had dropped low enough to cast long shadows, but the air still carried the heat of the afternoon. Daniel's stride was steady, the oats shifting slightly on his shoulder as they walked. Clara kept pace beside him, though her legs burned from the miles she'd been walking every day. He didn't speak for the first stretch of the road, and neither did she. She could hear the faint creak of leather from his suspenders and the crunch of his boots against the hard-packed dirt. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, but she kept wondering why he'd made the offer. A man with his own place could have ignored her and gone on with his day. Daniel's place came into view after they rounded a bend, a small, square-built house with a low porch, the boards weathered gray from years of prairie wind. A stack of split cordwood was piled neatly against the side, and beside it stood a smaller shed with a slanted roof. No other buildings in sight, no neighbors close enough to hear a raised voice. Clara noticed that. "Been here long?" she asked, her voice careful. "Going on 4 years," he said, stepping up onto the porch. "Wasn't much when I bought it. Fixed it up between hauls." He opened the door and held it for her. A man needs a place to come back to. Inside, the air was cooler. The scent of pine soap and strong coffee hung in the room. A plain wood table sat near the window, a cook stove in the corner with a kettle resting on top. The floors were swept clean, and there wasn't clutter, just the kind of order that came from one person living alone. Daniel set the oats down and motioned toward a short hallway. "Rooms back here." She followed him to a narrow space at the rear of the house. A small bed sat under the single window, a folded quilt at the foot. A washstand with a basin and pitcher stood against the wall. A bolt was fixed to the inside of the door, clean, oiled, easy to slide. "You can lock it from in here," he said, tapping the bolt once. "No one comes around. Nearest place is a mile off." Clara stepped inside fully, her hand brushing the smooth wood of the doorframe. She hadn't had a door she could lock since she'd left home. For a moment she didn't trust her voice, so she just nodded. Daniel stood in the hall, not crowding her. "I'm gone most mornings with the freight teams. Back before sundown unless something keeps us. There's beans, flour, and coffee in the pantry. Water barrels out back. You'll see the pump." She looked at him then, trying to read him. "You sure about this? You don't know me?" "I know enough," he said simply. "You needed a place. I had one." Her chest tightened. She wasn't used to someone stating it that plainly, without weighing what they might get in return. She thought about her father's last words to her. The barn, the cold nights, and the coins spinning away in the dust. By the time she found the words, he'd stepped back toward the kitchen. "You eat yet?" he asked. She shook her head. "Stew on the stove," he said. "There's enough for 2. That evening they ate at the table with the lamp casting a soft circle of light between them. Daniel didn't push her to talk. When she did speak, she told him about her family, not every detail, just enough for him to understand why she was here. He listened without interrupting, his steady gaze making her uneasy at first, then calmer. After the dishes were washed and set to dry, he showed her again how the bolt worked. She slid it into place once to feel the weight of it, then opened it again. He gave a short nod and stepped away, leaving her to close the door. Alone in the small room, she sat on the bed. Her hands rested on her knees, and for the first time in weeks, she felt the strain in her back begin to ease. She wasn't sure how long she'd stay, or if the offer was truly without conditions, but for tonight she had walls, a door, and a lock. That was enough. The next morning, Clara woke to the sound of boots crossing the porch and the creak of the front door closing. She lay still, listening to the faint scrape of metal as Daniel worked the stove. The smell of coffee reached her through the open door of her room. She wasn't used to waking somewhere she didn't have to leave right away. For weeks, every morning had meant deciding which direction to walk before someone told her to move along. When she stepped into the kitchen, Daniel was pouring coffee into 2 tin mugs. He glanced at her once, not startled to see her, just acknowledging. "Mornin'," he said. "Morning," she answered, her voice low from sleep. He nodded toward the table. "Sit, bread's fresh." They ate in quiet, the kind that didn't need filling. She watched him between sips of coffee, noticing how deliberate his movements were, not slow, but measured. He told her he'd be hauling feed and fence posts to a ranch south of town and wouldn't be back until sundown. If you need anything, Mercantile's got a line of credit for me. Just tell him you're staying here. Clara hesitated. You're trusting me with that? He met her eyes. If I didn't, you wouldn't be here. When he left, the house felt too still. She spent the morning wiping down the table, sweeping the floors, and going through the pantry. The beans, flour, and jerky were enough to keep her fed, but she decided she'd make something decent for supper. It had been too long since she'd cooked in a real kitchen. Later, she walked the short path into town. Heads turned the moment she stepped onto Main Street. Two women outside the dressmaker's shop stopped talking mid-sentence to watch her pass. A pair of boys near the water trough stared openly, one whispering to the other before they both laughed. She kept her chin level and went inside the Mercantile. The owner, a man in his 50s with a weathered face, greeted her politely but glanced at her height once before looking down to weigh the sugar she asked for. When she mentioned Daniel's name for the credit, he just nodded and wrote it in the ledger. Reed's a good man, he said, handing her the parcel. Keeps to himself. Back at the house, Clara set the sugar on the shelf and put beans to soak for the evening. She found a small iron pot and set it on the stove, letting the water warm while she sliced what little meat was left in the larder. It felt strange making a meal for someone who hadn't demanded it, just offered a place in return. By the time the sun began to fall behind the cottonwoods, she heard the creak of wagon wheels and the sound of hooves on the road. Daniel came through the door, dust in his hair and sweat darkening his shirt. He set down a sack of potatoes and handed her a small bundle wrapped in paper. Inside was a piece of salted pork. Figured you could use it, he said. She added it to the pot without a word. When they sat down to eat, he took the first spoonful, then looked up. This is good. The corner of her mouth lifted slightly. Haven't had a kitchen to work in for a while. They finished the meal in steady quiet. She noticed how he didn't rush, how he waited until she was done before pushing back from the table. After the dishes were washed, he asked if she'd been into town. When she nodded, he studied her face for a moment. Anyone give you trouble? Nothing I couldn't walk past, she said. He leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing slightly. If someone does, you tell me. Something in his tone made her believe he meant it. That night, in her room, she slid the bolt across the door and sat on the bed. The sound of his boots crossing the floor in the other room was steady and unhurried. For the first time in months, she didn't feel like she had to be ready to leave before sunrise. She wasn't sure how long this would last, but for now she decided she would stay. The next Saturday, Daniel hitched the wagon early and told Clara he was heading into town for supplies. She hesitated before asking if he wanted company. His answer was short, if you want to come, but there was no hint of reluctance in it. She'd been keeping to the house and the path to the pump all week, and part of her wanted to see if walking beside him would make a difference in how people looked at her. The morning was cool enough that she wore her shawl, the pale blue dress beneath still pulling slightly at the shoulders and chest despite her recent repairs. She knew the neckline hung lower than most women in Pine Creek preferred, but fabric was scarce, and she wasn't about to ask him to buy her another dress before she'd earned her keep. She stepped into the wagon and settled on the bench beside him, keeping her hands folded in her lap. They reached Main Street mid-morning. The saloon doors swung open as they passed, releasing a wave of noise and the sharp smell of whiskey. Two men on the porch leaned back in their chairs, eyes following her openly. One of them muttered something low, and the other chuckled. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he didn't turn his head. Instead, he guided the wagon toward the Mercantile and set the brake. Inside, the owner greeted them both and asked after Daniel's hauling work. Clara noticed the way his tone changed, slightly respectful, but curious when he glanced at her. Daniel asked for flour, coffee, and nails, then stepped aside to let her choose a length of cloth from the shelf. She picked a sturdier weave, enough to strengthen the bodice and keep it from slipping at the shoulders. When they stepped back out into the street, Daniel carried the heavier parcels. They made for the cobbler next. Clara's boots had been rubbing her heels raw, and Daniel said plain as anything, "We're fixing that today." The cobbler, a wiry man with sharp eyes, measured her feet without a word, disappearing into the back and returning with a pair of sturdy men's boots. "Only thing close to your size," he said. She tried them on and felt the space in the toe unfamiliar but welcome. Daniel paid without hesitation. By the time they passed the saloon again, the two men from earlier were still there. One of them called out, "Big woman like that, you'll have to build a bigger house." His tone carried the same mean humor she'd heard all her life. Daniel stopped the wagon just long enough to look directly at them. "You'll keep your mouths shut around her," he said evenly. There was no shouting, no threat, just enough weight in his voice to end it. The man's smirk faltered, and neither spoke again. Back at the house, Clara helped unload the supplies. She set the new boots by the door and ran her hand over the leather. "You didn't have to," she said. "Sure I did," Daniel replied. "Blisters slow a person down." They spent the rest of the afternoon in separate tasks, Daniel mending a loose board on the porch, Clara reinforcing the bodice of her dress with the new cloth. When she tried it on later, the neckline sat a little higher, the fit more secure. She caught him glance her way once, not in surprise but in quiet approval. That evening they shared supper without much talk. Still, there was a shift, a sense that the space between them had grown steadier, more settled. Clara realized she hadn't felt the old instinct to count the miles she'd have to walk if she left. For the first time since stepping into Pine Creek, she thought about staying longer than just until the weather turned. 2 days after their trip to town, the weather turned. A hard rain rolled in from the west, the kind that didn't come in bursts but settled over the land like it planned to stay a while. By mid-morning, the yard had turned soft underfoot, and the wagon road out to the main trail was nothing but thick mud. Daniel had gone to check the roof for leaks before the storm came through, but now he stayed inside, boots set near the door, hair damp from the trip to the woodpile. Clara had spent most of the morning shelling beans and tending the fire. The sound of the rain on the roof was steady, a low drum that made the rest of the house feel quieter than usual. She found herself glancing toward Daniel more often, noticing how he moved deliberate, unhurried, the kind of man who didn't waste motion. He sat at the table, whittling a piece of pine into the start of a spoon. His hands were large but precise, each cut smooth. She realized then she still didn't know much about him beyond the few things he'd said: 4 years in the house, work with the freight teams, an older brother gone. Most men she'd met had told their whole story in an hour, usually loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. Daniel seemed to think the less said, the better. "What made you stop here?" she asked suddenly, keeping her eyes on the beans. He didn't look up from the spoon. "Work was steady. House came up for sale. Figured I could fix it up in between hauls." "No family left?" He set the knife down and leaned back slightly. "Not close by. Brother raised me after our folks passed. He's gone now." There was no change in his tone, but she caught the way his jaw shifted before he picked the knife back up. She thought about telling him more of her own story, but the words were harder to start than she expected. She'd told him once that her family turned her out, but not how sudden it had been, how her father had made her leave before sunrise, how her mother had stood by the door but never spoke. The memory was still a raw edge. The silence stretched, but it wasn't sharp. She could hear the rain against the window, the soft scrape of his knife on wood. After a moment, Daniel spoke again. "You've been carrying yourself like you're waiting for someone to knock on the door and tell you to go." She blinked at him, surprised by how close he'd come to naming the thought she'd been trying to ignore. "That's because it's happened before," she said quietly. "Not here," he replied, meeting her eyes now. "You've got a room, food, and work if you want it. That's not going to change tomorrow, the day after." Her chest felt tight in a way that wasn't fear. She kept her gaze on the table, unsure how to respond without showing too much. That evening, the rain slowed but didn't stop. They ate the beans with cornbread and a little of the salted pork. She noticed how he waited for her to take the first bite before he started. After the dishes, she set a lamp on the table while he worked the last shaping cuts into the spoon. When he handed it to her, she turned it over in her hands. It was smooth, balanced. "For the kitchen," he said simply. It was a small thing, but she understood it was also a statement, a sign that he saw her here long enough to use it. She set it in the crock with the other utensils and glanced at him. His expression hadn't changed, but his eyes stayed on her a second longer before he pushed his chair back. When she went to her room that night, she slid the bolt across the door out of habit, but the need to do it didn't feel as urgent. The sound of his boots crossing the floor in the next room was steady and familiar, and for the first time she thought she might not be just passing through. The rain finally stopped 2 days later, leaving the yard soft underfoot and the air heavy with the smell of wet earth. Daniel spent the morning repairing a section of fence that had loosened in the storm. Clara worked inside, scrubbing the floorboards and setting the kitchen to rights. She noticed that, Lately, she didn't feel like she was doing chores for someone else's benefit. She was keeping a place that felt more and more like her own. By the time the sun dipped low, the light inside the house was warm and steady from the lamps. Daniel came in from outside, his shirt damp at the collar from sweat and his hands smelling faintly of cedar from the fence posts. He washed up at the basin while she ladled stew into 2 bowls. They ate at the table as usual, but she could feel something in the air that hadn't been there before, a longer pause between his words, the way his gaze stayed on her a fraction longer when she looked up. She remembered how he'd told her she wasn't going to be turned out of this place, and the thought lingered, quiet but heavy. After the dishes were set to dry, she noticed him pause by the table, as if deciding whether to leave for his room or stay. He chose to stay. "You've been here near 2 weeks now," he said. She nodded. "Feels longer." "Not in a bad way?" "No," she answered, her voice steady. "Not in a bad way." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. He took a step closer, close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes. "You've been carrying your guard high," he said. "I understand why. But I want you to know I'm not waiting for you to leave." Her pulse picked up. She'd been told many things by men over the years, usually promises that fell apart under the weight of what they really wanted. But there was nothing in his voice that felt rehearsed. "Why?" she asked, the word coming out before she could stop it. "Because I like having you here. Because you make the place better." Her breath caught. She stood still when he reached up, slow and without pressure, to touch her face. His calloused palm was warm against her cheek. She didn't move away. They stayed like that for a long moment before he lowered his head slightly. She met him halfway, their lips brushing in a slow, steady kiss that felt more like an agreement than a question. His other hand rested at her waist, steadying her, and she found herself leaning closer, feeling the weight of his presence more than anything else. When they finally stepped back, neither of them spoke. He didn't push for more, just held her gaze for another moment before moving toward the stove to bank the fire for the night. She stood at the table, her hands resting on the edge, still feeling the warmth of his touch on her cheek. In her room, she slid the bolt across the door as she always did, but she knew she could have left it open without worry. For the first time in years, she went to bed without feeling like she had to keep her boots close at hand. The days after that first kiss passed in a quieter rhythm, but it wasn't the same kind of quiet they'd shared before. There was a weight to it now, a steady awareness that hung between them in the way he lingered at the table a little longer after supper, or how she sometimes found herself standing closer to him when they worked side by side. Neither of them spoke of it, but the change was felt all the same. 3 weeks later, Clara sat on the edge of her bed one morning, staring at the small calendar she'd marked with faint pencil lines. She had been keeping track of her cycles since she was old enough to understand what they meant. She counted twice, then a third time, her stomach tightening when the same answer came up. She was late. Her first thought was disbelief. All her life she had been told her size made her less of a woman, that no man would want her. And if one did, her body would never give him children. That had been thrown at her so often she had started to believe it. And yet here she was, staring at the numbers, feeling a nervous heat rising in her chest. She spent most of the day carrying the knowledge alone, unsure whether to tell Daniel before she was certain. The fear wasn't about him being angry, she had never seen him lose his temper with her, but about what it would mean if she was wrong. That evening, Daniel came in from hauling freight, dust on his sleeves and the faint scent of sweat and horse clinging to him. He noticed her quietness before they even sat down to eat. "Something on your mind?" he asked. She hesitated, her spoon hovering over the stew. "I might be expecting." His hand stilled where it rested on the table. For a second she couldn't read his expression. Then his shoulders eased, and he leaned forward slightly. "You think so?" "I'm late," she said plainly. "More than a little." He nodded once, his eyes steady on hers. "If you are, we'll be ready for it. If you're not, we still are what we are now." The calm in his voice surprised her. She had braced for questions, for doubt, but instead he spoke like it was the simplest truth in the world. "Don't you mind?" she asked carefully. "I told you I wanted you here," he said. "That doesn't change because we might have a child." Relief hit her in a slow wave. She hadn't realized how much of her had been waiting for a different answer. The next morning she walked to the midwife's small house at the edge of town. The woman, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, welcomed her in, and asked her a few quiet questions before nodding. "From what you've told me, I'd say it's likely," she said. "Your body's doing just what it should." When Clara returned home, Daniel was repairing a harness strap on the porch. She told him what the midwife had said, and for the first time since she'd met him, he smiled in a way that reached all the way to his eyes. That night, as they sat at the table with the lamp between them, Clara caught herself looking around the house, the sturdy walls, the neat shelves, the new boots by the door, and realized it no longer felt like a place she was borrowing. It felt like the start of a life that belonged to her, to both of them. The next week, Daniel told Clara he needed to haul a small load of goods into town and asked if she wanted to ride along. She agreed, knowing the trip would mean facing the stares and whispers she'd managed to avoid lately. The morning was crisp, the wagon wheels crunching over the packed dirt road, and Clara sat beside him with her shawl drawn around her shoulders. When they reached Main Street, the usual eyes followed them. A few people nodded at Daniel, polite enough, but their glances slid toward her with the same mix of curiosity and judgment she'd known all her life. She kept her chin level, determined not to shrink from it. Daniel stopped first at the mercantile. They stepped inside, and the shopkeeper greeted them warmly, asking after Daniel's work. Clara picked out a few things they needed: flour, coffee, and a spool of thread while Daniel settled the account. On their way out, two men lounging near the saloon's porch caught sight of them. "That the big one you've been keeping out there," one of them called, his tone dripping with mock humor. "Heard you've got her working for her keep." Clara froze for half a second, the words stinging more than she wanted to admit. She'd heard worse, but something about hearing it with Daniel there made it land differently. She started to walk on, but Daniel stopped in his tracks, turning to face them. "She's not working for her keep," he said, his voice low but carrying. "She's my wife." The words hit the air hard enough to still the conversation on the porch. Clara felt her breath catch. He'd never called her that before, not even in private. The two men blinked, their smirks fading, and one muttered something under his breath before looking away. Daniel didn't wait for a reply. He took her hand and started walking toward the church at the far end of the street. "We're making it official," he said quietly. Inside, the preacher looked surprised to see them but didn't ask questions. Daniel explained they wanted to marry that day. With only the preacher's wife as witness, they spoke the simple vows, signed the paper, and Clara felt the unfamiliar weight of a gold band sliding onto her finger. It wasn't fancy, but it was real, and it was hers. When they stepped back outside, the afternoon sun was bright, and Daniel kissed her on the church steps where anyone could see. It wasn't rushed or shy. His hand rested firmly at her waist, pulling her close in a way that told the street, and anyone still watching, that there was no shame in it. Back at the house that evening, she stood at the washstand and caught sight of herself in the small mirror. The ring glinted in the lamplight. For years, she'd been told no man would want her, that she would never have a home of her own. Now she had both. Daniel came up behind her, resting his hands on her shoulders. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "More than all right." He kissed the top of her head and let his hands linger, the warmth of them grounding her. She knew there would still be talk in Pine Creek, but it no longer mattered. The paper was signed, the vows spoken, and the man standing behind her for all to see. Winter came early that year, laying frost across the yard before the last of the leaves had fallen. Claire's pregnancy had moved past the quiet stage into the slow, constant work of carrying new life. Daniel had built a cradle from pine, smoothing every edge by hand, and set it in the corner of their bedroom. She'd sewn small clothes from scraps of flannel and cotton, her stitches careful and even. When the labor started, it was just after midnight. The fire in the stove had burned low, and the cold in the air was sharp enough to sting. She woke with a tightening in her belly, stronger than anything she'd felt before. Daniel was up instantly, pulling on his shirt and boots, stoking the fire, and sending for the midwife. By the time the older woman arrived, the contractions had become steady and deep. The hours that followed blurred into a rhythm of pain and breath, Clara gripping the edge of the bed, her hair damp against her face. Daniel stayed at her side through all of it, his hand steady on her shoulder, his voice low and constant. He didn't try to fill the air with words she didn't need, just stayed where she could see him, where she could feel his presence. The midwife worked with calm precision, guiding Clara through each push until, at last, a sharp cry filled the room. The sound broke the tension like sunlight breaking through heavy clouds. The midwife laid a small, warm, squirming baby girl against Clara's chest. Clara let out a long, shuddering breath, tears sliding into her hair as she looked down at the tiny face. Daniel stood over them, his eyes fixed on the child. When the baby's fist curled around his finger, his jaw tightened, and for the first time since she'd met him, Clara saw his eyes glisten. "She's perfect," he said softly. They named her Ruth, after Daniel's mother. The midwife stayed long enough to be sure mother and child were resting safely, then left them in the quiet glow of the lamplight. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed, one hand on Clara's knee, the other gently stroking the baby's back. "You did it," he murmured, pride and relief tangled in his voice. "I didn't think I could," Clara admitted. "You can do more than you think," he replied. "Always could." The days after Ruth's birth settled into a different kind of routine. Daniel took over the heavy chores, hauling wood and water so Clara could rest. Clara kept the baby close, learning her small sounds, the way her tiny fingers would cling to the fabric of her dress. Neighbors who had once stared with judgment now came by with loaves of bread or a pot of stew, curiosity softening into acceptance when they saw the baby. By early spring, the yard was green again. Daniel had planted a row of beans and was mending the fence by the pasture. Clara stood on the porch with Ruth in her arms, watching him work. The sight filled her with a steady warmth she'd never known a home, a husband who had chosen her without hesitation, and a daughter who had proved every cruel word she'd been told about herself wrong. That evening, after Ruth was settled in the cradle, Daniel pulled Clara into his arms by the fire. He kissed her slow and sure, the same way he had the first time, and when they parted, he rested his forehead against hers. "We've got everything we need right here," he said. Clara smiled, her hand on his cheek. "And we're keeping it." Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods, but inside the house the air was warm and still, their little family complete. No questions remained. Pine Creek could talk all it wanted. This was their home, and they had built it to last.